Well, good evening and welcome. My name is Alan Spate. I'm director of the Institute for Philosophy and Religion here at Boston University. Tonight's lecture represents two firsts. It is the first in the 42nd Annual Institute for Philosophy and Religion lecture series, this year devoted to the topic of toleration and freedom in a global age. It is also the first in a new collaborative venture by two interdisciplinary programs at BU, ours in the Institute for Philosophy and Religion, or IPR, and the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs, or CURA. I'll say more about that in just a moment. The issue of toleration is one which I think most of you will agree could hardly be more topical. From Gainesville to Ground Zero, from the schools of Kabul to the Lycée of Paris, contentious claims about the tolerable and the intolerable have made their way into the media these last several months. Our lectures over the next few weeks will examine both contemporary and historical philosophical arguments for toleration, as well as particular cultural and religious experiences of dealing with what the political philosopher Michael Walzer has called way of life differences. We begin tonight with the important categories of secularization, and secularism, categories that, like toleration itself, are bound up with the development of our understanding of modernity. The notion of the secular will also be very much to the fore in the next collaborative IPR and CURA lecture on October 13th, when Tariq Ramadan, professor of Islamic Studies at Oxford, will lecture. Please put that on your calendar. If you'd like to know more about what's on tap in the coming weeks, please feel free to take a copy of one of the brochures that you see on the table, or check our program's websites, bu.edu/IPR and bu.edu/CURA. You can also sign up at the table to be part of our email listserv if you'd like. Collaborations, as we all know, are born of both inspiration and hard work, and tonight's is no exception. CURA director Bob Hefner and I had a conversation, almost a year ago, about ways in which our two programs, with some 65 years of composite interest in topics like toleration and secularism, might put together some new interdisciplinary events. The IPR, which dates to 1970, with specialization in philosophy, religion, and the humanities, and CURA, founded in 1985, with its social science expertise and long experience with specific religious traditions, especially in the Islamic world. I've very much enjoyed working with Bob to set this up, and I want to thank both him and his fellow CURA board members, including Adam Seligman, who is tonight's respondent, for all of their support in helping get this underway. Bob took over the CURA directorship last year after having been associate director and director of CURA's program in Islam and Society. He has directed some 15 major research projects and organized 11 international conferences. Some recent projects of his have examined Sharia law and citizenship in Muslim-majority countries, the culture and politics of Muslim education, and the prospects for civil democratic Muslim politics. He has authored or edited 15 books, including a volume of the forthcoming new Cambridge History of Islam devoted to Muslims and modernity. Bob's wife, Nancy Smith Hefner, who's here with us tonight, is also an anthropologist and teaches at Boston University. And the fruit never falling far from the tree, I should mention that his daughter, Claire Marie Hefner, is a trained classical Indian dancer, a graduate student of anthropology at Emory University, and is preparing to head off to Indonesia to do research on the lives of young madrasa girls. Because Bob clearly needs more to do, I asked him if he'd introduce our speaker tonight and get our evening underway. Bob Hefner.
Thank you very much, Alan. Let me just add my thanks to you for taking the lead in bringing about this collaboration between our two institutes. It was both an interesting conversation back, I believe, in early October of last year, and something of a discovery to see the range of issues in which we shared common interests and to which we wanted to steer our institutes. So thank you very much, and I want to thank everybody for taking time out tonight in what is a beautiful night and a beautiful fall day to come to this talk by Jose Casanova. Jose will be responded to, as Alan said, by my colleague at CURA, Adam Seligman. Adam needs no introduction, so I'll just say one sentence about him. He's been here, I think, since 1993, 1996. and is a distinguished sociologist and historian of religion, as well as an intellectual historian, if I may say so, of such a range of topics, ranging from civil society, the idea of civil society, one of his earliest and most celebrated and cited works, and a slew of works on religion and public life, tolerance, toleration, and pluralism. So I won't say more. I'm not doing justice to the CV, but it's a great pleasure, Adam, to have you as the respondent. Jose Casanova, a few words on him before we begin. And on the topic of the sociology of religion and secularity. It's a good time these days to talk about religion and sociology, religion and society, but it's not always been this way, not least of all from a sociological perspective. We have to remember that by the 1970s and early 1980s, the study of religion and sociology had become something of a rather staid and dull field. A decade or two earlier, things had been entirely different. Scholars like Brian Wilson, David Martin, and of course, Boston University's own Peter Berger, had helped to move the study of religion into the very heart of sociology and to the larger concern with the sociology of modernity. However, it was an interdisciplinary field, and the secularization thesis to which most sociologists of religion in the 1950s and 1960s had subscribed had forecast that as a society becomes more modern, religion becomes more privatized, or hardline proponents of the secularization thesis claim declined outright, even to the point of oblivion. So the sociology of religion, particularly the secularization wing of it, became something of a victim of its own success. For many observers, and notwithstanding the popularity of various new spiritualities, the great cultural revolution we in the West, that today we know as the 1960s, added to the conviction that in the modern scheme of things, religion is no longer very important, and even where it is, it's not very intellectually interesting. Today, as I think everybody in this room knows, all this has changed, and it's changed dramatically. And although I'm not much of a fan of great man or great women theories of intellectual history, I'll say tonight that perhaps more than any other person in the world, our guest speaker, Professor Jose Casanova, was the single most important player in the revival of the sociology of religion in general and the vast industry of studied interest in the topic of the place of religion in modern society and modernity itself. In a series of learned, and I have to emphasize, interdisciplinary publications, and in his role as the president of the Association for the Sociology of Religion, Jose Casanova, again almost single-handedly, reinvented the field of the sociology of religion, giving it a much more vigorously, I might add, comparative emphasis. He did so, moreover, in what was, for a sociologist, not perhaps for an or less perhaps for an anthropologist, a most unusual two-pronged way. First, he got his feet dirty, very dirty, doing comparative and aerial research, working in Spain, the Ukraine, Poland, and the United States on religion and public life, and he still does that. He's a man who has several projects going simultaneously. In fact, I was speaking with him, had a 5-minute coffee with him before we came here today, and I can't even keep count of the number of projects that he described that he's involved in. The second prong was that he leapt into the maelstrom of high sociological theory, indeed the sociology of religion's core intellectual instrument, that is secularization theory, and he reconstructed it in an entirely original and important way. One has to emphasize this. He didn't just throw it away and say secularization theory is wrong. We don't need to discuss it. In fact, he reinvented it, reanalyzed it in a really remarkable and I think effective way. In his masterpiece, Public Religion in the Modern World, he showed that religion in the West, and he noted in most of the rest of the world, had broken with its assumed pattern, in liberal theory in particular, of private conviction, privatization, and it had begun to go public again. Drawing on but critically revising notions of the public sphere and civil society, He analyzed the conditions under which this religious resurgence could be compatible with democracy and modern social pluralism. Indeed, the topic of pluralism looms large in everything that he does and continues to do. Along the way, and in the years since, Casanova has authored a series of powerful works, always highly original, always very readable at the same time, on topics as varied as Islam and modernity, gender and modern religious change, religion and migration, not least of all to the United States and Western Europe, and the sources of Pentecostalism's globalizing power, among many other works. I think I've left some things out. Let me end this introduction with a few biographical old standards, and here I'll just read them since there's nothing original to them, but I will note them nonetheless. Casanova received his BA in philosophy from the Seminario Metropolitano in Zaragoza, Spain. Then he received an MA in theology from the University of Innsbruck, an MA in theology, I'll repeat that again, and another in sociology from the New School for Social Research. He completed his PhD in sociology at the New School in 1982, and then he taught at the New School from 1987 to 2007. I think I met you about 5 years into your tenure there. He also occupied numerous distinguished positions, including chair of the Sociology Department and the Committee on Historical Studies. In addition to his primary appointments, he has visited academic positions all around the world, and he is, of course, today professor of sociology at Georgetown University. He also happens to be, as I said with my reference to the early 1990s, a personal friend of mine, as well as a teacher, someone from whom I have learned so much. Jose, it's a great pleasure to welcome you, and I hope that you would join in welcoming him today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, for this, I would say, almost inordinate praising presentation. I don't recognize myself, but thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here tonight to present the first in this lecture series. And particularly, it's a great pleasure to be sandwiched between two of my very good friends, Bob and Adam. We've been having conversations around these issues for many, many years. And it's a pleasure to be back and to continue the conversation. I usually don't read my lectures, but I will do it tonight because otherwise it's too much of a topic, it's too broad, and I have to be concise. It's a great picture to announce the lecture series. Toleration and freedom in a global age, and you have the typical veiled woman. And of course, the ambiguity of the picture. Does it speak for the need to tolerate Islam and veiled women? Or does it speak for the need of women to be liberated from religion? And again, its use, the picture, the ambiguity is in this respect interesting, and it precisely indicates the problems, the difficulties we have in dealing with all these categories. I'm going to start my lecture by giving some results from public opinion surveys in Europe, which will show how much the topic secularization, secularism is related to the topic of toleration and freedom. Indeed, it's astounding to observe how widespread is the view throughout Europe that religion is intolerant and creates conflict. According to the 1998 ISSP, the International Social Survey Program public opinion poll, the overwhelming majority of Europeans, practically over 2/3 of the population in every Western European country, held the view that religion is intolerant. This was a widespread view, moreover, already before September 11. Since people are unlikely to expressly recognize their own intolerance, one can assume that in expressing such an opinion, Europeans are thinking of somebody else's religion, or alternatively, present a selective retrospective memory of their own past religion, which fortunately they consider to have outgrown. It is even more telling that the majority of the population in every Western European country, with the significant exception of Norway and Sweden, were only 47–49%, so it was not a majority, shares the view that religion creates conflict. It should seem obvious that such a widespread negative view of religion as being intolerant and conducive to conflict can hardly be grounded empirically in the collective historical experience of European societies in the 20th century or in the actual personal experience of most contemporary Europeans. It can plausibly be explained, however, as a secular construct that has the function of positively differentiating modern secular Europeans from the religious other, either from pre-modern religious Europeans or from contemporary non-European religious people, particularly from Muslims. So when they think of religion as intolerant, obviously Europeans are not thinking of themselves, even when many of them may still be religious, but rather they must be thinking either of the religion they have left behind or of the religion of the other within their midst, which happens to be Islam. Insofar as they identify religion with intolerance, they seem to imply that they have happily left their own intolerance behind by getting rid of religion. The argument for tolerance becomes, in this sense, a justification for secularity as the source of tolerance. Most striking is the view of religion in the abstract as the source of violent conflict, given the actual historical experience of most European societies in the 20th century. The European short century from 1914 to 1989, using Eric Hobsbawm's characterization, was indeed one of the most violent, bloody, and genocidal centuries in the history of humanity. But none of the horrible massacres, neither the senseless slaughter of millions of young Europeans in the trenches of World War I, nor the countless millions of victims of Bolshevik and communist terror through revolution, civil war, collectivization campaigns, the Great Famine in Ukraine, the repeated cycles of Stalinist terror and the Gulag, nor the most unfathomable of all, the Nazi Holocaust and the global conflagration of World War II, culminating in the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, none of those terrible conflicts can be said to have been caused by religious fanaticism and intolerance. All of them were rather products of modern secular ideologies. Yet contemporary Europeans obviously prefer to selectively forget the more inconvenient recent memories of secular ideological conflict and retrieve instead the long forgotten memories of the religious wars of early modern Europe to make sense of the religious conflicts they see today proliferating around the world and increasingly threatening them. Rather than seeing the common structural context of modern state formation, interstate geopolitical conflicts, modern nationalism, and the political mobilization of ethno-cultural and religious identities, processes central to modern European history that became globalized through the European colonial expansion, Europeans prefer seemingly to attribute these conflicts to religion, that is, to religious fundamentalism and to fanaticism and intolerance, which is supposedly intrinsic to pre-modern religion, an atavistic residue which modern, secular, enlightened Europeans have fortunately left behind. One may suspect that the function of such a selective historical memory is to safeguard the perception of the progressive achievements of Western secular modernity, offering a self-validating justification of the secular separation of religion and politics as the condition for modern liberal democratic politics, for global peace, and for the protection of individual, privatized religious freedom. This is the foundational myth, not only of the modern nation's secular state, but also of Western secular modernity, namely the foundational myth of the wars of religion. And I'm saying that you may want to read the fantastic book by William Casanova, The Myth of Religious Violence, which basically really deconstructs this myth. But I came to this conclusion well before reading Casanova when about several years ago I was invited to the trilogue. The trilogue at the Salzburg Festival, a very festive occasion, where they try to do also help Middle Easterns, Jews, Muslims, and Christians who cannot live together in the Middle East. And I heard the same story of the the foundational myth repeated again and again by the foreign minister of Germany, Joschka Fischer, by the foreign minister of Austria, I don't remember her name, by the head of the Salzburg Festival, and by the head of the Bertelsmann Foundation, the big German foundation that was sponsoring the trilogue, or the trilogue. And the story went like that. We Europeans, once upon a time, also didn't know how to live together. We also had fused religion and politics. The consequence was the terrible religious wars of early modernity. But happily, because of this catastrophe, we learned to separate religion and politics, and look at us now. Please, if you Middle Easterns would learn from us, you would know how to live together. You bring secular liberal democracy, and this is the solution to the problem of religion. So the notion that secularism and the secular state is the solution to the problem of religion is the foundational myth of secular modernity. Of course, there is a myth in the dual sense that our categories are so shaped by this myth that we cannot think otherwise, first. But it's a myth because history is not like that. We know that out of the Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia, didn't come the secular state. What came was the confessional, territorial state that confessionalized religions, territorialized religions and peoples, and what the result was not religious tolerance. It was ethno-religious cleansing. Cuius regio eius religio. The notion that the religion of the ruler becomes the religion of the subjects. And if it doesn't happen to be your religion, tough. You have the right to emigrate. It was not religious freedom. It was not religious toleration that came out of the Westphalian peace. It was simply the right to emigrate. And in this respect, the process has been repeated again and again whenever the mother nation state has been established beyond Europe. The Ottoman Empire falls apart every time. In the Middle East, in the Balkans, it repeats the story. In India, when the British Empire falls apart, everywhere the nation state emerges, you have basically a repetition of the so-called religious wars of early modernity. The question is whether it is religion which is the problem and the secular state the solution to the problem, or it has to do something with the very process of formation of the globalization of the modern nation state. But so let me then try to introduce some analytical distinctions, basic distinctions between these three categories, the secular, secularizations, secularisms. Yes, bear with me a second until I reorganize my papers. So let me introduce the basic analytical distinction between the secular as a modern epistemic, as a central modern epistemic category, secularization as an analytical conceptualization of modern world historical processes, and secularism as a worldview and ideology. All three concepts are obviously related, but are used very differently in various academic, disciplinary, and sociopolitical and cultural contexts. I propose to differentiate the three concepts simply as a way of distinguishing analytically in an exploratory manner between three different phenomena without any attempt to reify them as separate realities. So first, the secular. The secular is often assumed to be simply the other of the religious, that which is non-religious. In this respect, it functions simply as a residual category. But paradoxically, in our modern secular age, in our modern secular world, the secular has come to encompass increasingly the whole of reality, in a sense replacing the religious. Consequently, the secular has come to be increasingly perceived as a natural reality devoid of religion, as the natural, social, and anthropological substratum that remains when the religious is lifted or disappears. This is the conception or epistemic attitude which Charles Taylor has critically characterized as subtraction theories. The paradox resides in the fact that rather than being a residual category, as was originally the case, the secular appears now as reality per se, while the religious is increasingly perceived not only as the residual category, the other of the secular, but as a superstructural and superfluous additive which both humans and societies can do without. Theories of secularization have emerged as explanatory conceptions of this process of differentiation and liberation of the secular from the religious, understood as a universal world historical process, while secularist worldviews function as justificatory explanations of the paradoxical inversion in the dyadic relation of the religious and the secular, vindicating not only the primacy of the secular over the religious, but the superseding of the religious by the secular. Both function as uncritical and unreflective ideologies insofar as they disregard, indeed mask, the particular and contingent historicity of the process, projecting it onto the level of universal human development. Moreover, by postulating the secular as the natural and universal substratum which emerges once the superstructural religious addition is lifted, theories of secularization, as well as secularist social science, have avoided the task of analyzing, studying, and explaining the secular, the varieties of secular experience, as if it is only the religious, but not the secular, which is in need of interpretation and analytical explanation. Indeed, what is the secular? Do we know? Does anybody know what is the secular? Well, the other of the religious. And what is the religious? The other of the secular. You cannot define the secular without the religious, and you cannot define the religious without the secular. But what is each of them? So let me introduce an analytical distinction between three different meanings of the word secular, or three different ways in which one may be said to be secular, to which will correspond three different understandings of the process of secularization. So first, mere secularity, simple secularity, living in the secular world and in secular time. This is the broadest possible sense of the term secular, which is derived from the medieval Christian theological transformation of the Latin term seculum. Originally, the Latin word seculum, as in per secula seculorum, only meant an indefinite period of time. But as first used by Augustine, the secular referred to a temporal space between the present and the eschatological parousia, the second coming of Christ, in which both Christians and pagans could come together to pursue their common interests as a civil community. In this respect, the Augustinian use of secular is very similar to the mother meaning of a secular political sphere, that of the constitutional democratic state, and that of a democratic public sphere, which is neutral with respect to all worldviews, religious as well as non-religious. Such a conception does not equate the secular with the profane as the other of the sacred, nor is the secular the other of the religious. It is precisely a neutral space that can be shared by all who live in a non-religiously homogeneous or in a multicultural society, which by definition will have different and most likely competing conceptions of what is sacred and what is profane. This was precisely the situation in late antiquity. Judeo-Christian monotheism had led to a desacralization or disenchantment of the pagan sacred. Consequently, the Christians' refusal to sacrifice to pagan gods or to worship the divine emperor earned them the epithet of atheist. The Christian sacred was the pagan profane, and vice versa. Eventually, however, with the consolidation of Western medieval Christendom and the hegemonic triumph of the Christian church, the secular became one of the terms of a dyad, religious secular, which serves to structure the entire spatial and temporal reality of medieval Christendom into a binary system of classification separating two worlds, the religious, spiritual, sacred world of salvation, and the secular, temporal, profane world. The sacred profane and the religious secular binary systems of classification became superimposed, and the secular became now equated with the earthly city, while the religious became equated with the heavenly city. Thus, the distinction between the religious or a regular clergy, who withdrew from the world into the monasteries to lead a life of Christian perfection, and the secular clergy, who live in the world along with the laity. It is from this theological perspective of medieval Christendom that the modern meaning of secularization emerges. To secularize means, first of all,